everybody. It's Katie with Ria Health, and I'm here today with a very special guest. I'm here today with Dr. Adi Jaffe. He is a nationally recognized expert on mental health, addiction, and stigma, and has just written this book, The Abstinence Myth. Are you going to bring it up? Yeah. The Abstinence Myth, a new approach for overcoming addiction without shame, judgment, or rules. So I'm so excited to be chatting with you today. I devoured this book in like 2 settings. It's just over 100 pages and it's a really interesting read. So first, just thank you so much for taking time to be with me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So I'm super eager to talk to you. I want to dive into some of the concepts you have in the book. But just to begin with, I want to chat about your own personal story with addiction. I know your own story with addiction led you to the work that you're doing in the field and ultimately writing this book. So can you just tell me a little bit about your battle with addiction and really how it led you to wanting to do work and transforming the way we treat addiction in America?
Yeah, absolutely. My own battle, I guess, really technically started, as I talk about it, with my discovery of alcohol. So even though my end addiction wasn't really to alcohol in particular, and I'll get into that in a moment, I discovered the power of alcohol to help me overcome really some severe social anxiety and lack of feeling like I fit in and belonged and was able to integrate socially in my circles, especially after my family moved and I found myself with a new social circle that I wasn't familiar with. And I don't know if anybody can relate to this, but I felt out of sorts and out of place all the time. And then I kind of thought I would have to live with that forever. And at the age of 14, I found alcohol at a camp. Literally, I talk about it in the book, but at a sleepaway camp, somebody just brought out a big bottle of vodka. And I did not know, after having, it wasn't that, probably 3 or 4 swigs of this vodka that tasted terrible and just made me almost want to throw up. But once I waited 20, 30 minutes, I felt okay for the first time in years. I remember literally there's this vision. I don't even think I put this in the book, but on the bus back from that sleepaway camp, we're all going to Newark Airport where we were flying back. I was living in Chicago. And I was like standing in the aisles dancing. I wasn't drunk anymore. But I had felt like I'd made such close friends because we drank that weekend that I was totally comfortable. And I hadn't had that in a really, really long time. And that was the first moment that I discovered that chemicals can give me the feeling I've been looking for. And so it started with that, and then weed got introduced 2 years later. And then I had a really bad breakup in my first year of college, and I went to everything that I could find. So it was cocaine, it was ecstasy, it was mushrooms and LSD. I just tried whatever I could, because the thing was, what I realized now is I had learned that there's a tool, and that tool is chemicals. And if chemicals can change the way I feel so that I feel the way I want to, then I then started this quest for finding the right chemicals to make me feel the way I need to or feel like I should. That led all the way to meth. And by the time I ended my addiction, and by that I mean my addiction kind of came to a screeching halt, and I'll get to that in a second, I was a meth addict. I had been using meth for 5 years, and the last 3 of those years I was a daily, and when I say that, I mean all day. Like, I had a pipe in my glove compartment in my car. I always had meth on me. I was using about $400 or $500 worth of meth a day for 3 years straight. And I was selling drugs. And essentially my entire life had become surrounded by these chemicals that I had given so much power to.
Wow.
And then I got arrested. Is the way it ended. Is full-on SWAT team arrest in my bedroom in Brentwood. The Beverly Hills Police Department was nice enough to make the trek all the way to Brentwood. And
oh my gosh,
8 o'clock in the morning, just guns to the head, everything, just like what you see in Scarface movies and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not going to lie and say that that's where my addiction ended, but that was like this huge stop sign of, you better start reconsidering what you're doing or else. And it still took me about 1 year to 3 years to get my stuff together.
Wow.
But what I learned in the process was that I had to create big enough changes in my own life so that, the way I talk about it now, so that I didn't live the life of somebody who could be addicted to drugs anymore. I didn't live the life of somebody who would still rely on chemicals to make their life better.
That's incredible. And I feel like that's the nugget that really is what leads this book. And it really takes me to my second question. In the book, you talk about addiction as a syndrome, meaning a set of symptoms that show themselves similarly for people, even if the underlying reason for their development is very different. So can you speak a bit more about this?
Sure, absolutely. So many people rest on this idea, excuse me, that addiction is a disease, and they put so much weight on that. And yet there's actually a pretty broad debate in the in the addiction treatment industry, but also in the general public and among researchers about what does that actually mean? Why are we calling it a disease or not? And without a doubt, we see very similar patterns show up for addicts, right? Cravings, using more than they want to, losing control when they use, giving up responsibility, social, employment, and familial responsibilities, and consequences, mounting financial, psychological consequences, legal consequences, etc. in the face of those still not being able to stop. So we see a lot of things that show up together, a lot of symptoms of addiction. And because we have these symptoms and because there's a biological piece to it, there's no doubt that drugs and other behavioral addictions interact with the brain and the body in ways that make people more likely to use them. People don't get addicted to snorting sand or eating celery because they don't interact with those same systems. And so people jump to this addiction thing. And for years, I feel like we've just left this part of humanity, the last 50 years or so, where if it was scientific and medical, then it was more important and it was more true. Are kind of these ways we looked at the world, right? Aspirin is good because we took the chemicals from a tree bark that people have been gnawing on for years as an anti-inflammatory, and we isolated the aspirin. And so the chemical is good because we produced it in the lab, and that makes it better than the stuff that's out there in the world. We've left that place. And about 70, 80, 90 years ago is when addiction as a disease started, alcoholism specifically as a disease, started becoming popular. Something biological that causes behavioral outcomes. So people rely on this a lot. And then anytime that you introduce any other elements to the conversation around addiction that are not purely biological and disease, people dismiss them. They say, well, but that's not true. Addiction is just a disease. First of all, we've gone to, I'll show another book, this book by Bruce Lipton, who I wish I would have read 10 years ago when he wrote it, but it's called The Biology of Belief. This guy started out writing about the idea of epigenetics as the interaction of what happens in the world and what happens in your body and the environment being all together. So biology is never the only answer to anything. It's the interaction in a place and time. And so I was trying to think, how do I use a word that still lets people understand that, yes, there are symptoms that are important and there's biology involved. We got to move away from this concept that it's all about biology and it's something like a virus that happens in your body. And as I was doing research on how to switch that word, syndrome just popped in my head. I come from a medical family, and so I was thinking, you know what, there are a lot of conditions actually that look similar but are quite different when you understand the underpinning of what happened to the individual to bring you there. And all a syndrome tells you is, yes, we have these symptoms, the cravings, the overuse, the consequences, all those things are the symptoms. But there's nothing that has to tell us that because you show those symptoms, the reason for your addiction, the underlying cause, is the same for everybody who's an addict. And that's a big piece of the Abstinence Myth book. I don't think addiction is one thing, and it's never been one thing. And I, if you've read any of my stuff, you know that I'm huge on the power of language. And because we believe that addiction is a disease, not a set of diseases, but a disease, we've imagined that there is a cure for addiction, a specific singular fix for it. And I think those go together as part of the problem. Is if you think addiction is a disease, then you get a flu vaccine for the flu. You get the measles vaccine for the measles. You get one condition, one specific condition gets one specific cure. And that hasn't proven itself to be true. I think it's part of the reason why there's so much failure in addiction treatment in the world. And so syndrome releases us a little bit from trying to figure out what the disease is, and rather saying, okay, addiction can show up as a whole, as one thing, but actually be caused by a whole different set of underlying reasons. And we can't fix the symptom. We have to go back and fix the reason for the development of the condition.
Absolutely. And there's a statistic out there, which I've heard, in my own research and learning, and you reference in your book, that 90% of people struggle with alcohol addiction, who are struggling with it, don't get help. Why do you think this is?
Yeah, that statistic is part of the reason probably why I left academia and said, screw this, I've got to get out there and actually start making a difference. It was shocking to me when I first heard it. There's not another condition that we have these kinds of numbers for. Like, just for reference, by the way, for cancer, so in addiction, about 1 out of 9, 1 out of 10 people who meet criteria for the problem and are told they have a problem go get traditional help, like professional help. In cancer, that's flipped. About 9 out of 10 people who are diagnosed with cancer at least get one course of treatment for it. I did research on this. I actually did research at UCLA on why, and I found 4 main reasons, and they were cost, logistics, shame, and abstinence were the 4 main reasons that I found. And cost is pretty obvious. It's in the last 10 to 15 years, addiction treatment has gotten really expensive in many places. Logistics are also pretty obvious, right? If you have to leave your life for 30, 60, 90 days, or go report somewhere for 15, 20 hours a week for treatment, it creates real barriers for normal people who have a job and a family, et cetera, to go get help. So those 2 are obvious. Shame, addiction is still so looked down upon, even with 100 years of conversation about it. It's one of those things that nobody wants to be forthright about and tell others in their life that they struggle with. So they try to handle it on their own. They try to fix it by themselves, and they dig themselves into a deeper and deeper hole oftentimes. And then finally, abstinence. A lot of people, and I think this makes sense if you completely shift your perspective on addiction. For a lot of people, the idea of having to commit to giving up the only thing that is making life okay for them before getting any help is absurd.
It sounds crazy when you say it like that.
I literally equate it to telling a quadriplegic that the only way they can get physical therapy is if they leave their wheelchair at the door.
Wow.
They're relying on alcohol or opiates or whatever it is that they're relying on in the moment to just get through the day. And what most practitioners in the field tell them is, you need to stop that first and then come get help. And they go, I can't stop this. If I could stop this, I wouldn't need your help anyway. So those are the 4 barriers that I see. And I think, again, my belief in what I do in life now is try to eliminate as many of those barriers and give people help that doesn't include them at all.
Definitely. And I want to read an excerpt from your book. You say, addiction, the daily grind, the pressure and judgment we face from both inside and out, wear us down and make us forget that it's possible to truly love our life. And I feel like you articulated that so well. And as I read this, I feel like it really articulates the vicious cycle that keeps people trapped in addiction, a lot of what you were just talking about. So how is it that somebody begins to get out of this cycle and this experience and just start to see that glimpse of what's possible?
It's a great, great question. And to be fully frank, that is probably something that I constantly struggle to make better and easier for the people I work with, because again, it's so individualized, right? And so for most of the people that I work with, at some point earlier in life, they lost hope. They lost the internal belief that they are able to be anything but that, whatever it is they ended up at. I struggled with it, right? I thought I was a piece of, who was never going to amount to anything, who lacked motivation and couldn't follow through on anything and was going to disappoint everybody in my life forever. And that was a really difficult position to start from because you don't see an endpoint. What people need, I think, first and foremost, is the belief that it's even possible. That's why, like in the Abstinence Myth, I don't start out by giving people tools. I start out by giving people stories and examples, my own and others, of other people in dire situations who found a way out. Because that is the first thing people need to understand, is that there is a way out, and they need to believe that. So that's number one. And then the second one is once they believe it, I think people do need to start exploring what is it. I said that, addiction is actually a very individual route to those end symptoms that we've talked about. I do think people need to look inside and understand what happened in their life that created those limiting beliefs for them, and then dismantle those step by step. And it's difficult. I mean, some of the people that I work one-on-one with and send me texts and we talk pretty frequently have, for all intents and purposes, almost given up the idea that they can be happy.
Wow,
and
given up the idea.
Yeah, and I don't think that's that uncommon in addiction. They've been through the system. One of these people that I was just talking to today, that's why she's coming to mind. They've been through dozens of therapists, a handful of treatment episodes, and nothing has made things better. And you can imagine how disheartening that can end up being to somebody, how defeating that can feel. And so I think really reinstating that belief that it's even possible is the first step. And a lot of times that is by speaking out. That's why I speak out in these ways all the time. That's why I wrote the book. I called it the Abstinence Myth and I've had this now happen a few times, that a family member will call me and say, I don't know what to do. My loved one won't go to therapy. They won't go to rehab. They won't do anything. And I know that abstinence is a really big piece of the puzzle. And I go, just show them the book. Like, they don't even need to read it yet. Just show it to them. And when they see that somebody has written something that does not start out with, you have to quit to get better, they'll at least open it up. They'll at least consider the conversation, and then we can put in the tools that we all know work.
Definitely. And, this eliminating abstinence is the barrier for getting help. It's what you talk about in your book. And it's something that's really personal to me as well in my own story of alcohol addiction, because I was really struggling for about 10 years. And I began on naltrexone a year and a half ago to really get into a healthier place with alcohol, because abstinence was like a huge, I couldn't even conceive of it. I tried many times and failed and didn't want to be abstinent. But now, a year and a half in, I am abstinent or sober, or don't drink anymore, because the medication really helped. I've done a lot of inner work and it's brought me to this place. So
awesome.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I'm curious, how have you seen this approach, being abstinence not required, help people to overcome addiction, and the people you work with and the people in your world?
So here's my favorite thing that I think everybody needs to hear, and almost nobody will remember as soon as I stop saying it, because it happens to me over and over and over. Not requiring abstinence as the first hurdle, the first barrier for people to enter treatment, does not at all mean that people don't end up being abstinent. It's the biggest misconception, and I hate it. And I've been fighting it for 7 years, and I don't know another way of doing this, because all people will remember from the end of this is, this guy doesn't think people need to abstain. And that's okay. It is what it is. But 40 to 50% of the people who come to me seeking not abstinence, but an improvement, decide to be abstinent in the end. Some people find completely different routes. So for instance, some of the people that came to me for alcohol and were daily blackout drinkers, these are not, people think that I deal with, women who have 2 glasses of wine a day and drink a little too much. Some of the people I deal with are exactly who somebody would call an alcoholic, daily blackout drinkers. And a lot of these people experience either a complete return to abstinence or such huge reductions in their drinking, like going from drinking every day to blackout to drinking 2 to 3 times a month, with essentially none of those being blackouts, but sometimes drinking a little more than they want to, and returning back to those inner tools. The removal of abstinence as a starting point is a way to get people in the door, because I don't understand. There is no other field that I know of in the world where you have to commit to the success before getting help. It sounds insane to me, and it sounded insane to me since I started going into the field. But it's a little bit like asking an athlete who wants to learn how to play football at the age of 5 to be able to throw like Tom Brady in order to be able to practice. It's insane. I talk to people all the time. I literally got an email from somebody just a few days ago. They listened to my podcast, or I think they might have heard this online free workshop that I have, and they said, I read the example of that daily blackout drinker who drank 4 times in 3 months. Are you saying it's okay for him to drink those 4 times? And I go, how did you go from somebody going from 90 days of drinking in 3 months to 4 days of drinking in about 4 months? And the only thing you can focus on are the 4 days he drank as the mark of failure. I go, how do you do that in your own head? Like, what does the rest of your life look like if the only measure of success is complete and utter perfection? It seems insane to me. I don't know how we've gotten to this place. It's like I wouldn't start a job unless I'm the CEO. It's just ridiculous. It's like there's no gray area for people in this field. There's no middle road to success. As you just mentioned yourself, the reason you took on naltrexone in the face of all these past failures was that it offered a route that didn't include abstinence as a key initial ingredient. And yet look at what you're going through now. You're now abstinent. And it doesn't matter if you'll be abstinent forever. None of those questions even matter as part of the equation. The point is you've achieved greater success by removing a barrier to getting into treatment than the entire industry, and I'm talking like 85 to 90% of the industry, has been able to over a century insert into itself, right? By putting that barrier in place, we have kept 9 out of 10 people out of getting help. It's freaking insane. And I will do whatever I can to make the industry understand that it's stupid, it's counterintuitive, it might even be unethical to be doing this on a continuous basis.
Yeah. I think your voice is really important in this realm, and you're speaking about it in ways that haven't really been brought up before, and questioning things in a way that's really unique. So I'm super excited to see the work you continue to do.
Thank you.
In your book, I wanted to ask you, refer to your story as the hero's journey. And this is a reference I learned from through Joseph Campbell and kind of understanding my own life, in the hero's journey kind of framework. I feel like when I've applied this to my life, it's really brought about a sense of more magic and wonder and understanding in my life. And so can you briefly explain, how you would define the hero's journey and how people can embark down their own hero's journey when they're deciding to really fix this alcohol dependence or whatever substance use dependence?
Yeah, I love it. I mean, the program I created online is literally called the Ignited Hero Program. Okay. And the reason I ended up there is, again, the importance of language, right? Addicts are told more than anything else that they're losers. That's it. I mean, I don't know how you felt when you started on the journey, but the main thing you feel like is a loser. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows what you have to do, right? Just stop. Everybody has told you how to do it. Go to an AA meeting or just quit cold turkey or just get yourself together and just become a good person. And you run against this wall over and over and over, and you feel like a complete and utter failure. That's the shame piece that is so important. I mean, I wear this, I don't know how you guys feel about swearing, but it's about to happen. I wear this fuck shame bracelet right here. And that comes from my TED Talk. And it's something I have to remind myself all the time. When I start feeling embarrassed and ashamed of who I am, I need to check myself really, really quickly, because that is, to me, a dangerous route of going back to hiding and going back to doing things that are unhealthy to reduce that shame. And so I didn't think of my journey as a hero's journey at all. I mean, there was nothing heroic about it as I was going through it. But now that I've told it so many times, I really had to stop and think for a moment, why do people love it? Like, why do people have the same reaction over and over and over when I tell it? And that's when I got connected to this whole concept of a hero's journey, which I believe we all have inside of us. It has nothing to do with me. It just has to do with the perspective I have on my life. And the reason I call my program the Ignited Hero Program is because we do something very quickly right at the beginning of the program when people engage to get them to understand that they are their own hero already in this moment. And I literally tell people, the fact that you got here, the fact that you've made it through everything you've made it through, and I don't know your personal story, but I guarantee it's there as well. The fact that you made it to this point already makes you a hero. You just haven't gotten to the act that you want to get to. You haven't gotten to the final piece that you believe will create that for you. And you might not even think it's possible right now, but you're already a hero. And so the goal is to really understand how the challenges and the tribulations and the struggles that you've experienced in your life have formed you into the hero that you are. And I'll tell you, look, just like naltrexone, just like CBT, just like everything that exists in the world, this is not 100% foolproof. Sometimes people have a really hard time stepping into this role. But when you see people shift into this perspective and stepping into, oh my God, hold on, I'm the hero of my own story. I get to write what the next chapter is. I get to understand and select what the next challenge is going to go like. It completely shifts the way they look at everything, every task they have to complete, every challenge that they have to undergo in life. And if you can shift that perspective, which it took me 12 or 13 years into my hero's journey to get there, it's like I looked back and went, oh, the reason people really like this story at a party, because look, nobody likes the, hey, I'm a meth addict and I steal shit for a life and sell drugs. Like, that's not a story that goes well in any party other than among other addicts. But I used to be a meth addict, and then I went back to school and got my PhD, and now I help other meth addicts like that, or alcoholics or sex addicts. Like, that story makes people feel good. But I tell people in my course all the time, it took 12, 13, 14 years for that to happen. We lose track of the fact that we can be heroes 10 years from now because we feel so terrible about ourselves right now that we don't take the steps to make ourselves those eventual heroes.
Totally. So well said. And I know you have a whole chapter in your book on the power of stories and how we can at times get stuck in a role that we're good at playing and that others expect of us. So can you explain how this experience of being kind of stuck in a story that might not be serving you, how that might contribute to someone leaning on alcohol or other substances for relief?
Sure. Do you mind if I turn this around on you for a second? Because I don't know what it is, but I just alluded to it. I don't know if you feel like getting personal in this, but
go for it. Yeah, that's great.
So I don't know what a year and a half ago was like for you, but it was much worse than things are right now. Mm-hmm. But you had tried, it sounds like you seem pretty young. It sounds like maybe you started a few years beforehand, you were already trying to get some help.
Yeah.
At what age did alcohol start playing a role for you?
About 21, 22.
So you waited a while. Now, for somebody who normally starts at 21, again, we haven't done this before, so I don't know any part of your story. But for somebody who normally started at 21, I would imagine one of two things was happening, and it might have been a combination. There was either an ongoing amassing of stress and anxiety and discomfort that led all the way to 21, but you were actually a really good law-abiding person, so you waited until 21 to start drinking. And then when you drank, you had the experience I had at 14, or things were actually relatively functional and okay environmentally and psychologically for you as you were growing up, but you didn't have access to alcohol. And then either the access by itself turned something biological on in you, or there was a traumatic event or something negative that happened around that age, 2021, that happened. Do you mind sharing?
Yeah, no, yeah, it was more the first, it might have been the combination of the two, because I drank before then. I started drinking as a teenager, but I hated it, and I hated the way it felt, and all of that stuff. But I started, I was very insecure, and my circumstances led me to be with someone who was an alcoholic, and so it was really easy for me to lean on that to feel secure. And
okay. So in the context of the book, and we'll talk about stories in a second, it wasn't biological primarily for you because your body didn't react to alcohol the way you really loved it to. And so that wasn't there. And maybe the environmental stressors weren't there to really drink heavily beforehand. But psychology, you had some of that insecurity, and that probably came from early childhood sort of issues. And then you got in one of those relationships. And so now the environmental influences, in my book, there's kind of 4 factors. So environment and psychology play the biggest role for you. Again, you can see how addiction can be totally different things, right? Biology that everybody focuses on so much was not a big player in your field so much. And so now you had psychology and environment that were really, really huge factors. Now, my guess for somebody, again, we've never done this together, but for somebody that ended up in a relationship like that, my guess is there was a lot of self-worth issues going on there. And there was a lot of feeling trapped, like
exactly,
almost literally kind of this feeling of, I hate my life, but outside of this, if I do something other than this, it's going to be even worse. Right? Like, at least here, I know how to function. I know how to be relatively safe in this context. And so whenever you try to pull yourself away from that, the feeling of I'm still worthless and nobody's ever going to love me and I'm going to be stuck alone and lonely and scared the rest of my life. That's the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that story was always there in the back of your head. Every time you tried to stop, first of all, this other person would probably pull you in some ways. And they probably used the same story on you. They probably told you, you're not going to be anything. You're never going to be anything. This is going to lead to you're going to be in this problem forever and ever and ever. And when you have that story in the back of your head, the tools don't matter. Cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't do anything because your core belief is that you're a weak, worthless person. And weak, worthless people don't have great lives.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we live in this world where all we get is to compare ourselves to these perfect images of others all around us that seem like they have the best life ever. We don't celebrate struggle. We don't celebrate transformation. We don't celebrate, I'll call it weakness, but I mean by that challenges.
Mm-hmm.
We instead talk about things as if you have to just leave them aside and not talk to anyone about them and kind of deal with them on your own. And so in addition to all those other things I just mentioned, you also felt alone in the middle of all of that. And what I tell people in terms of stories is you have to get to a place where you can at least believe, identify, start writing a different existence for yourself. I talk about it in one of my podcasts, in order to beat addiction. And I talk about it in terms of beating it, not curing it, because I don't think it's necessarily a disease, but beating it in a way that it doesn't come back. You have to become a person who is no longer addicted. And that means wholesale changes in how you see yourself, the way you live your life, your daily rituals, and the people around you and the support network that you have present around you. So all those things, we get so trapped in the way we see ourselves that we don't actually believe a different version is possible. Once we switch that perspective, a lot of things open up.
That's amazing. Yeah. And, in your book, you give an example of a client of yours whose husband can only focus on her drinking and nothing else. So it's very much just about the drinking. And you state that for the most part, everyone fixates on the visible behavior rather than the feelings or circumstances driving it. So a lot of what you're speaking about here. So a loved one of someone who is addicted, how can they support someone struggling with addiction and begin to focus more holistically rather than just on the substance use?
This is a really good question because I didn't actually realize how relevant saying that in the book was until when people started writing to me afterwards, like on Instagram and all these other, and by email, they were writing to me about, hey, I heard about your approach either on a podcast or reading a book or something like that. And I want to help a loved one. How do I do it? And one of the things I always ask is, have you ever come up to them and just said, I see you struggling. I'd love to help if you're willing to let me help. And some people say, yeah, I've had exactly that conversation. I said, okay, when you came to them though and said that, what were you wanting to help them with? And they said, well, they're drinking. And I go, yeah, they don't want help with their drinking. They're not looking for help with the drinking. They're using the drinking for help on something else. Forget the drinking for a second. Just go to them and say, you seem like you're really suffering. Like this, literally a woman just asked me about her boyfriend just the other day about this. And I said, look, he's falling asleep drunk every day because other elements of his life are causing him pain. Forget the drinking. Go and talk to him about what is causing him pain. And if he's not able to talk about it, then that's okay. But at least have the conversation that you see underneath the drinking. You see that there's something there. This whole bullshit of like the fact that alcoholics are different than other people, it drives me insane. It's like, it's as if we've literally created, it's not as if, we've created like a different class of people. It's like alcoholics live over here and the rest of humanity lives here somewhere. And it is so dehumanizing and so demoralizing for the people that we say that to. And we think we're helping them. Like, hey, I identified your problem. You're this kind of a person. What's been going on for decades for a lot of these people, and at least years for most of them, is that they don't have a real way of addressing, dealing with, and resolving the plethora of issues they've been struggling with internally and externally. And when another person comes back and says, don't you see that if you just stop this drinking, everything will be better? You completely alienate yourself from them, because of course they see that the drinking is causing problems. They're not fucking idiots.
Yeah.
You know, the last thing I say to a client is, you need to stop drinking. Because if they do, then I'm just repeating the same thing they've told themselves a million times, and it's just more disheartening. And if they don't, then I'm not giving them anything useful to be able to use, right? And so for this woman, what I said is, go back and say, forget the drinking for a second. I'm here to hold your hand through whatever is happening in your head. Mm-hmm. And the problem, and I think why a lot of us have a struggle with this, is those are normally not easy issues that are on the back end of that. Mm-hmm. Early childhood sexual abuse, abandonment by your parents, violence at home, inconsistency and struggle with alcoholic parents who were never there and were abusive psychologically and sexually and physically. Deep mental health struggles that have been there for decades that people don't, like, the answers you're going to get are not simple. Yeah. Oh yeah, I didn't like my outfit last week, and so I've really been drinking too much. Those are not the answers you can get. But if you really want to help somebody, go help them with that.
I think that's amazing. And I want to ask you, in your book, kind of piggybacking on this, you talk about how alcohol takes the edge off when the true purpose of the edge is to remind us that we need to develop better communication and healthy intimacy. So for people who are dependent on alcohol for years or decades to take this edge off that you're talking about, to numb out these experiences from our past or whatever the reason is we're numbing out, how might they begin to get comfortable with exploring that edge alcohol-free?
Whoa, what a great question. I think the first thing is the permission to start exploring it, right? Kind of like I was just talking about the loved one. Mm-hmm. Somebody saying it's okay to talk about this pain, you don't have to hide from it anymore, is the first step, probably. Just understanding that this is not something you need to take on your own. That's the first thing. Now, with alcohol in particular, for instance, so this probably plays a role for people with opiate addictions and benzos as well. The chemicals are so good at removing the pain that for a lot of people, they're disconnected from the fact that the pain exists or what it is even at that point. And then the second important piece of it is, because of the substance use, the problem has actually been exacerbated over the time frame that this has happened, because your body is less biologically able to produce its own break, its own stress reduction chemicals, because you've been using these other things as supplements for so long that not only you're now psychologically less able to rely on your own internal mechanisms, but your body is less able to generate them. And so the first thing that you need is a lot of support. A lot of support is one of the answers that people gave in the study that I did when I was at UCLA on barriers and why people don't enter treatment, is they said they want to do it alone. And I get it, because the shame is so overwhelming that you want to fix this and then be able to go to everybody and say, hey, look, I fixed it on my own. I'm good now. But it's so hard without support. It's so hard to do this without anyone. And so I really recommend that people find someone to hold their hand through this, whether it's a professional who understands you, a loved one, a friend, a parent, somebody in a support group. It doesn't matter who it is, but somebody who will hold your hand, doesn't have an agenda, but rather is just there to support you, because that space to explore the pain that you've been running away from for so long, the way I talk about it in my course is, what I ask people to do is, they've been running in one direction away from all this pain that has been overwhelming them for years. And I ask them to stop and turn around and look at it in the face. That's a scary proposition. And so to have a wingman woman to be able to hold your hand, to say, you're okay, and we're going to deal with this together, is a huge step. Because the process after that is actually a difficult one.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you so much for taking time to speak with me. And I guess my last question is, how do people find your book?
So the book is available on Amazon. If you want to get it on Amazon, there's now an audiobook too. If you go to theabstinenceMyth.com, I actually bought like 1,000 of these books, and I'm giving them away for shipping. So
Wow.
if you'll pay for shipping, I think you save like $4 or $5 over the Amazon price, which is nice. And then there's an audiobook that we sell along with it too, if you like listening to it. So either the abstinenceMyth.com or Amazon, it's available on either of those. And, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for having these conversations. I know Ria is doing a lot to give people options outside of the typical complex, the typical addiction treatment complex that has developed. And the more options we have, the more, I talk about the Sinclair method a lot in a lot of the work that I've done. And the more options people have that resonate with them, the more likely it is that we turn that 90% people who don't get help to 10%.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, same back to you. Love the work you're doing. Excited to see you continue on the field, and maybe we'll chat again soon.
I'd love it. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.